I need to start by telling you what kind of person I am, because it matters for what I'm about to describe. I'm a field ecologist. I've spent 14 years doing primary research in remote ecosystems, boreal Canada, Indonesian peat forests, Congolese basin. I operate on evidence. I document what I observe, I resist premature interpretation, and I have a very high threshold for what I'm willing to call unexplained. The unexplained, in my experience, is almost always a data gap rather than a genuine anomaly. I say this not to establish credibility but because it's the framework I was working inside when everything I'm going to tell you happened, and the framework stopped working, and I need you to understand how unusual that is for me. The assignment was a vegetation survey along a tributary of the upper Rio Negro, approximately 340 kilometers northwest of Manaus. 14 days in a research station operated jointly by a Brazilian university and an international conservation body. The station had been running for 11 years. It had hosted dozens of researchers before me. It had a data terminal, a shortwave radio, a satellite uplink, and a local assistant named Paulo who came by boat every 4 days with supplies and collected water samples. Paulo had worked the route for 6 years. He knew the river the way I know a laboratory, every variable accounted for, every deviation from baseline immediately recognizable. I arrived in late dry season. The river was low, the forest dense and still in the way that tropical forest is still, not quiet, never quiet, but contained. The station sat on a raised bank above the floodline, surrounded on 3 sides by primary growth that started 30 meters from the structure and didn't stop for hundreds of kilometers. The 4th side faced the river. The first 4 days were exactly what I expected. I established my transects, calibrated the equipment, and began collecting canopy data. The forest was extraordinary in the way that intact primary Amazon always is, the kind of biodiversity that makes everything you've seen before feel like a draft. I was working well. I was sleeping well. I radioed the university coordinator on day 3 and told her the site conditions were ideal. On day 5 I noticed the caimans. There is a sandbar visible from the station at low water, a pale crescent maybe 40 meters out in the river. During the first 4 days it had been occupied every morning by a group of spectacled caimans, 4 or 5 of them, doing what caimans do in the early dry season sun. Motionless, conserving heat, completely indifferent to my presence on the bank. On the morning of day 5 the sandbar was empty. I noted it without particular concern. Caimans move, water levels shift, there are 100 reasons a sandbar gets abandoned. I logged it as an observation without a strong interpretation and went to work. The sandbar was still empty on day 6. And day 7. On the evening of day 7 I was reviewing canopy photographs on my laptop when I heard the forest go quiet. This is a phrase that sounds dramatic but is actually a technical observation. The Amazon canopy at dusk is one of the most acoustically rich environments on Earth. Parrots, oropendolas, insects cycling in and out of frequency ranges, the background percussion of a system processing the shift from day to night. When it stops, something has changed in the environment. Something has introduced a variable that the rest of the system is responding to. I sat at the desk and listened. The silence lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then the forest resumed, not all at once but in sections, insects first, then distant birds, then the closer canopy layer. I logged it. Acoustic suppression event, 1847 local, duration approximately 4 minutes. Probable cause, large predator movement through adjacent sector. Probable cause. I wrote that and believed it. Anka, jaguar, could produce exactly that response. The upper Rio Negro corridor still has healthy jaguar density. It was the simplest explanation and I defaulted to it the way I always default to the simplest explanation. I didn't sleep well that night. Not from fear exactly, more from a specific alertness that I've learned to recognize over 14 years of field work as the body registering something the conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. I lay in the cot and listened to the river and the forest and told myself I was overtired. On day 8 Paulo arrived with supplies. I helped him unload at the bank and asked casually whether he'd seen anything unusual on the river. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me. He asked why I was asking. I told him about the caimans and the silence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the caimans on that sandbar had been there every dry season for the 6 years he'd worked the route. He said he'd never seen them leave before the rains came. He also said, and he said it in a way that was careful rather than alarmed, the way you say something you've thought about before saying out loud, that on his way upriver that morning he'd passed a section of bank about 12 kilometers south where something large had come out of the forest and entered the water. Not a caiman. Not a tapir. He'd seen the disturbance in the vegetation on the bank, a wide corridor, branches broken at height, the kind of displacement that requires significant mass. He hadn't seen the animal itself. He'd increased his speed and not looked back. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he didn't know. He said the river in that section had been strange for 2 weeks. He'd noticed it on his previous run and hadn't said anything because there was nothing specific to report. Just a quality to it. A feeling of something present in the water that he couldn't account for with the usual variables. Paulo was not a superstitious man. He was methodical and practical in the way that people who work remote river routes for 6 years have to be. I trusted his observations. After he left, I went back to my data and spent the afternoon trying to find a pattern I hadn't found before. I found it in the acoustic logs. I had been running a passive acoustic monitor at the edge of the cleared ground, a small unit that recorded continuously and flagged deviations from the baseline spectrum. I hadn't reviewed the full logs since setup. When I went through them that afternoon, I found 7 acoustic suppression events in 8 days. Not 1. 7. 5 of them had occurred between midnight and 4 in the morning while I was asleep. 5 times in 8 nights the forest around the station had gone quiet. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I checked the motion sensor I'd set up near the water samples tank on day 2, standard protocol at remote stations to detect wildlife interference with equipment. The log showed 11 trigger events in 8 days. I had personally accounted for 4 of them, my own movements during night checks. The other 7 had no corresponding entry in my field log. 7 motion events I hadn't caused. 5 acoustic suppression events while I slept. I contacted the university coordinator that evening on the satellite uplink and described what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me that the previous researcher at this station, a botanist who had completed a 12-day rotation 8 months earlier, had submitted an incident report upon returning that she described as difficult to categorize. She hadn't mentioned it at my briefing because the station had been used 3 times since then without incident and she hadn't wanted to bias my observations. I asked her what the report said. She read me the relevant section. The botanist had described waking on day 9 to find the door of the station unlatched from the outside. Not forced. Unlatched. As if someone had lifted the external latch bar and set it aside. Nothing inside had been disturbed. No tracks were found in the vicinity. The botanist had completed her rotation, filed the report, and not returned. I spent the remaining 6 days of my rotation working my transects, collecting my data, and sleeping with the acoustic monitor running and the door braced from inside with the equipment case. Nothing entered the station. Nothing disturbed my equipment. The motion sensor triggered twice more, both times between 1 and 3 in the morning, both times when I was inside. On my last morning I walked to the river and stood on the bank and looked at the sandbar. The caimans were back. 4 of them in their usual positions, motionless in the early light as if they'd never left. I don't know what to make of that. I've thought about it many times since returning and I still don't have a category for it. The caimans returned on the day I left. Whatever had displaced them from that sandbar for 9 days was gone, or had decided to be gone, which is not the same thing. The data I collected was clean. The paper I produced from it has been cited 12 times. The acoustic suppression logs and the motion sensor data are filed as supplementary material under the heading Environmental Anomalies, Unresolved. That is the official category. I have been back to the Amazon twice since then. Different sites, different rivers, different coordinates. I work differently now than I did before that rotation. I review the acoustic logs every morning, I account for every motion sensor trigger before I sleep, and I pay attention to sandbars. What I cannot tell you is what was moving around that station at night. What I can tell you is that whatever it was understood the geometry of the place, where the equipment was, where the door latch was, when I was inside and when I wasn't. That last part is what stays with me. Not what it was. What it knew. I grew up on the river. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest of this. Not near the river. Not in a town with a river running through it. On the river, in a community of 43 families built on stilts at the edge of a varzea, the floodplain forest that fills and drains with the river's pulse twice a year. The nearest city was 6 hours by boat. The nearest paved road was further than that. The forest started at the edge of our community and did not stop. We had a generator that ran 3 hours a night, a satellite dish that worked when the weather permitted, and a school with 2 teachers who served children from 4 years old to 14. After 14 you went to the city where you stayed and worked the river. I stayed. I worked the river for 9 years after school ended, fishing, transport, the occasional supply run for the research stations upriver. I knew the river the way you know a person you have lived with your whole life, the moods of it, the exceptions, the things that look like one thing and are another. I am telling you this because what I am about to describe was not something I misread. I know the difference between what belongs in that forest and what doesn't. I knew it before the night I am going to tell you about, and I have never doubted it since. The disappearance started with SCU Raimundo. SCU Raimundo was 61 years old, had lived in the community his entire life, and knew the forest around the varzea the way I knew the river. He collected Brazil nuts, hunted paca and catia, ran fishing lines in the igarapes that cut through the flooded forest at high water. He was not a man who got lost. He was not a man who made errors in the forest. In 40 years of working that land he had never needed to be found. He went into the forest on a Tuesday morning in the low water season to check a line of Brazil nut trees he'd been working for 20 years. By Thursday evening he had not returned. By Saturday the community had organized a search. I was part of the first group that went in. We found his bag at the base of one of his nut trees, the tools he used for collection, his water container, a cloth he used to wipe the sweat off his face. All of it arranged at the base of the tree with a neatness that didn't fit the idea of someone who had suddenly needed to move. Not dropped, not scattered. Set down deliberately, the way you set things down when you intend to come back for them. There were no tracks beyond the tree. The ground in that section of forest was soft enough, we had a late rain the week before, that his approach was clearly visible in the soil, each footprint distinct and readable. They led to the tree and stopped. There were no tracks leading away. There was no disturbance of the leaf litter, no broken branches, no indication of which direction he might have gone. I have thought about those tracks many times in the years since, and I have never found an explanation that satisfies me. 41 families searched that forest for 11 days. The state environmental police sent a team. A helicopter flew the area twice. SCU Raimundo was never found. What I'm going to tell you next happened 8 weeks after the search ended. It was the dry season, low water, the time of year when the varzea forest pulls back from the river and exposes the banks and the igarapes run shallow or dry. I was running a supply line upriver, a regular route I had done dozens of times, and I stopped at a point about 4 kilometers above the community to check on a fish trap I'd set 2 days earlier. The trap was at the mouth of a small igarape, a channel maybe 3 meters wide that cut into the forest for about 200 meters before splitting into smaller drainages. I left the boat tied and walked the bank of the igarape to where the trap was. The trap had fish in it. I was crouching at the water's edge dealing with the trap when I heard something move in the forest on the opposite bank. I want to be precise about the sound. It was not the sound of a bird dropping through the canopy. It was not the sound of a caiman entering water. It was not the sound of any animal I had spent 30 years learning to identify in that forest. It was a lateral movement through mid-level vegetation, branches displacing at a height of roughly 2 meters, moving parallel to the igarape, in the same direction I had walked, at approximately the same pace I had walked. As if something had been watching my approach from the far bank and had moved to keep pace with me. I stayed completely still. The movement stopped. Then it started again, from a position slightly ahead of where it had stopped, moving back toward the mouth of the igarape. Back toward my boat. I do not embarrass easily. I have been in situations in that forest that would have paralyzed someone who hadn't grown up there. I am telling you that what I felt in that moment was not the manageable alertness of someone encountering a predator in familiar territory. It was something older than that, the specific fear of something that isn't following the rules the forest has, the rules you've spent your whole life learning. I left the fish in the trap. I walked back to the boat at a pace that I am still not fully willing to describe as calm. I untied the line. I started the motor. As I pulled away from the bank, I looked back at the mouth of the igarape. There was something at the edge of the tree line. Not fully visible, half in the shadow of the canopy, half in the light. Large. Upright in a way that was not the uprightness of any animal I could name. It was still. It was watching me leave. I increased the throttle and did not look back again. When I got back to the community, I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. People were still raw from SEU Raimundo. The last thing a community that had just lost someone needed was another report of something in the forest that couldn't be explained. I told my wife I'd had a long day on the river, and I went to bed early and lay in the dark and thought about the tracks at the Brazil nut tree, the footprints that led to the tree and stopped, and about what SEU Raimundo would have done if he had crouched at the edge of an igarape and seen something large and still watching him from the far bank. He would have stayed calm. He would have assessed it. He was 61 years old and had 40 years of that forest behind him, and he did not panic. I have no conclusion to offer about what happened to SEU Raimundo. The official record says disappeared, presumed drowned, a classification that requires accepting that a man who knew that forest for 40 years walked into it in the dry season, set his bag down neatly at the base of a tree, and drowned in water that at that time of year was rarely above knee height. I have never accepted that classification. I have never found a better one. I still work the river. The route that passes the igarape I still run regularly. There is no other route north. Every time I pass it, I look at the mouth of the channel and I think about what was standing at the tree line. I have never stopped there again. I check the traps at the other sites and I leave that one empty. Some places in that forest have a quality that the people who grow up there understand without needing to name. Not supernatural, that word belongs to people who need a category for what they can't explain. Just wrong. A specific wrongness in the quality of the air and the silence that the animals feel before you do, and that stays in a place long after whatever caused it has moved on. Or hasn't moved on. That's the part I'm still not sure about. The igarape is still there. The tree line is still there. Whatever was standing in it that afternoon is still somewhere in that forest, or it isn't, and the forest has simply closed over whatever happened the way it closes over everything eventually, the way it closed over the tracks at the Brazil nut tree, the way it closed over SEU Raimundo. The Amazon doesn't explain itself. It never has. It keeps what it takes and it doesn't file reports. I check the trap sites from the boat now. I don't go ashore alone anymore in that section of river. My wife thinks it's because I'm getting older and more cautious. I let her think that. 2 accounts. 2 people who know what they're talking about. Neither of them has an explanation. If that stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next ones are already waiting.